Hmm. Hello, hello. Hope you're all doing well tonight. I'm going to share to a few places first. Okay. I know you're not all doing well. Okay. I know Stephanie is recovering from a still painful procedure. And I know we all wish her a very quick recovery. And an end to pain. This is coming along pretty well. I should be able to join you in a pretty brief time now. Meanwhile, please help me share. Thank you. Hello, hello, hello. Wow. What an explosion of likes and loves. Thank you, everybody. Hi, Kay. Hi, Dolores. Thanks, everybody, for sharing as much as you can. So Steph had an interview with RJ yesterday, huh? Yeah, RJ's a really nice guy. I'm sure it was a great interview. I'll be watching it very soon. Okay, please share as much as you can. Looks like people are busy tonight. It's a busy weekend. A lot of stuff is going on, and of course, it's Father's Day weekend. So there's that, okay, as well. So let me start to share the book and go over the many points we have to make tonight. I'd very much like to get through not only Chapter 4, but Chapter 5 as well. R.J. Eskow. He's the host of the Zero Hour, and he's a long-time commentator and writer in the progressive sphere. He used to write speeches for Bernie in 2016. He was the chief speechwriter at that time. During the most recent campaign, he was replaced by David Sirota, who fulfilled the same role for Bernie in 2020. RJ is very well known around these parts, Kane, Washington, as well as in California. He seems to show up a lot in both places. He's been very active in the healthcare fight for Medicare for all. He's very much for the Green New Deal also. And he's given space to Stephanie on various occasions. I'd say at least since 2015. I guess they first came together really seriously in the context of one of the annual daily cost meetings in California. I forget what they're called now. But they both were there. And Stephanie immediately charmed him, of course. Okay, let's start to share the book now. Here we go. You should be able to see it now without much difficulty. Let me make certain of that. Yep. I see that you can. So, okay, this is Chapter 4. Their red ink is our black ink. And you'll see as I go through, that's because of the sectoral balances. Anyway, myth number 4, government deficits crowd out private investment, making us poorer. And the reality statement to correspond with that is fiscal deficits increase our wealth and collective savings. Stephanie starts out by pointing out that we mostly get propagandized or bombarded, as she says, with fairly simple deficit myths. We're told to think of the federal government like a household that's recklessly overspending and running up the national credit card. And that sort of takes us through chapters 1 through 3. She points out these myths are built for mass consumption. They make great sound bites on television and in political stump speeches because they're so easy to articulate. You don't need a background in economics or anything else to quickly absorb the message. Other myths are harder to package because they're rooted in the jargon of mainstream economics and mainly espoused by academics and so-called policy wonks. That's us, right? We may not encounter them as frequently, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous. The quintessential example of this kind of myth is known as crowding out. And boy, Stephanie is right about that. She is so right about that. So right. The crowding out myth is in every report that the CBO releases. Every report they release on the budget brings in some form forth the crowding out myth. Anyway, Stephanie gives it in the following form. In its most common form, the crowding out myth says fiscal deficits require government borrowing, which forces Uncle Sam into competition with other would-be borrowers. As everyone competes for a limited supply of available savings, borrowing costs move higher. With interest rates on the rise, certain borrowers, especially private businesses, won't be able to secure funding for their projects. This causes private investment to fall, leading to a future where there are fewer factories, machines, and so on. With a smaller stock of capital goods, society ends up with a less productive workforce, slower wage growth, and a less prosperous economy. It does sound ominous, says Steph. And she goes on, it's a complex narrative that rests on a number of theoretical propositions if you've encountered it at all. It was probably on C-SPAN rather than Fox News or MSNBC. Even those of us who follow politics fairly closely might go a lifetime without hearing someone carefully articulate the crowding out story, but in Washington, D.C., it's everywhere. It appears as boilerplate in the CBO's long-term budget outlook. One of the most widely anticipated budget reports to come out each year. When she says, okay, it's boilerplate, she means there's always a passage in there. Oh, here she says, pick up virtually any edition, you'll find a section outlining the crowding out thesis. That's right, absolutely right. 2019 report described the supposed risk of fiscal deficits this way, quote, the projected path of federal borrowing would reduce output in the long run. When the government borrows, it borrows from people and businesses whose savings will otherwise finance private investment in productive capital, such as factories and computers. The professional class of budget wonks, academics, and Washington insiders treat it as an article of faith. Technical jargon and the heavy smattering of charts and data give the narrative an impressive veneer of credibility that can leave readers with the impression that crowding out is something that happens in a mechanical and inevitable way, much like a mathematical series of rigorously tested if-then statements. If deficits require more borrowing, then the supply of savings available to finance private investment is reduced. If the supply of savings is reduced, then interest rates will rise. If interest rates rise, then private investment will decline. If private investment declines, then the economy will grow more slowly over time. Tap the first of the dominoes, then the rest obediently give way. The whole story is rooted in a version of mainstream economics that dominates our public discourse. You hear it from liberal icons like the New York Times' Paul Krugman, as well as conservative commentators like the Washington Post's George Will. And if you do happen to watch C-SPAN, you might have heard someone like Jason Furman, a Harvard-trained economist, excuse me, who worked in the Obama White House as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, invoking it in testimony before Congress. For example, on January 31st, 2007, he appeared before the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, urging members of Congress to, quote, stem the flow of red ink, unquote. He described the budget outlook as a major fiscal challenge, quote unquote, that drives down national savings, quote unquote. He warned that the chain reaction of events that would ultimately jeopardize our economic well-being would be, quote, slow and gradual, but relentless and inevitable. Crowding out is a story that depicts government deficits as the villains of progress. Saving is considered an act of virtue because it is believed to supply the fuel that is used to fund the kinds of private sector investments that make us a wealthier society. Deficits are said to undermine that prosperity by siphoning away some of that fuel for its own use. Fiscal deficits and private investment are therefore considered to be in tension with each other. A trade-off, in other words, as government borrowing necessarily leaves behind a smaller pool of savings to support the needs of private industry. This is the conventional wisdom among mainstream economists. It may appear straightforward and compelling, but it is best thought of as a series of domino-linked myths. Absolutely correct. Again, absolutely correct. And this series of domino-linked events is found everywhere in Washington. Okay, I covered it in, well, I'm not saying that I'm an instance of it being everywhere in Washington, but I'm just informing you that I covered these linked sets of myths in my book, Fiscal Myths of Campaign 2016. And I covered it also in my two books on the Peterson Foundation. And I covered it also in my book on fixing the debt. So I've covered it in quite a few books and blogs. And of course, it's all over the MMT literature because all of us keep trying to debunk this silly myth. And we've been debunking and debunking and debunking for more than 10 years. And still, for 10 years, it continues to appear in the mainstream newspapers, okay, in the journals, in the business journals, and of course in the CBO reports every single year, and of course in the fiscal summits of the Peterson Foundations. Crowding out is all over the place. Nancy Pelosi will say it upon occasion. Kevin McCarthy will say it upon occasion. And lots of other people always think it's wonderfully sophisticated to talk about crowding out. We don't want to crowd out private investment and cripple innovation. That's what happens. So here goes Stephanie with her attempt to completely dismiss it and save us all from further time wasting. 2 buckets. When Furman urged lawmakers in 2007 to stem the flow of red ink, he was worried about a projected deficit of $198 billion, about 1.5% of GDP. Okay, I'm laughing because we're probably on track to hit a deficit this year of what, maybe 20% of GDP or something like that. It's going to be really, really big this year. Really, really big. He encouraged Congress to restore pay-go to prevent the deficits from climbing any further. He also complained that the private savings rate was at its lowest since 1939. In his view, the deficit was driving down national saving. Steph says he had it completely backward. To see why, imagine two buckets. One belongs to Uncle Sam. The other belongs to the rest of us, a sort of collective bucket in the name of everyone who is not Uncle Sam. It's a simple way to think about how dollars flow back and forth between these two parts of any economy, a government bucket on the one hand and a non-government bucket on the other. Very, very simple. Steph says, I learned the value of thinking along these lines from Wynne Godley, a British economist who now is dead, by the way, who pioneered the sector balance framework. It was 1997. I had just been awarded a year-long research fellowship that took me to the Levy Economics Institute, a think tank located in New York's Hudson Valley, where many of the most prominent MMTers go every summer to confer and convene and meet, and probably to party also, though I've never been there, so I can't speak from experience about the partying. I hope they party a few times, though, and then it's not all work. And Steph says, that's where I met Wynne Godley. I was still in graduate school, but I was given the office adjacent to his. We would sit and talk for hours. Godley was soft-spoken but intense. He played the oboe, often in his office, and had trained to become a professional musician. He lived most of his life in the UK, where he'd performed as the principal oboist in the BBC Welsh Orchestra before directing the Royal Opera, 1976 to 1987. His other professional love was economics. After a long career at the British Treasury, he was persuaded to move to Cambridge University, where he became the head of the Department of Applied Economics. He was a highly regarded figure in British circles, serving as one of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's, quote, 7 wise men, unquote. He always seemed to be able to anticipate where the economy was headed. The Times of London referred to him as the most insightful macroeconomic forecaster of his generation, though often a renegade. 3 years after his death, the New York Times paid tribute to his legacy, featuring him in an article entitled, quote, Embracing Wynne Godley, an economist who modeled the crisis. Steph says, I was fortunate to arrive at the Levy Economic Institute just 2 years after Godley took up a residency in New York. Water. Turn off the air, though. Okay. Sorry, I was saying something to Bonnie. He was a tall, slender man with wispy white hair that he would tug in frustration as he worked to find the perfect turn of phrase before allowing any of his work to be published. Godley was a macroeconomist like me, but his way of thinking about the economy seemed completely original. He built the macro models and used them to analyze the U.S. economy. One morning, he invited me to sit with him while he used his model to simulate the effects of an increase in government spending. You see, he said, every payment has to come from somewhere, and then it has to go somewhere, unquote. Godley was obsessed with building models that didn't leave anything out. Now, as you go from that last paragraph to this one, keep in mind the buckets, okay? Only 2 buckets? Everything has to come from one of the buckets, and then it has to go to the other bucket. Of course, he was building more complex models, but still, the same principle has to come from somewhere and then go somewhere. Godley was obsessed with building models that didn't leave anything out. He constructed huge matrices with lots of rows and columns, that is, lots of cells, in order to connect up all the moving parts in the economy. He told me it was the only way he could be sure he had accounted for every financial payment as it moved through the system. Each time a payment was made by someone in the economy, it had to be received by someone else. That's what he meant when he said everything had to come from somewhere and go somewhere. He built some pretty sophisticated models, but the one he seemed to find most useful was the one he called his one-equation model of the world. It wasn't like any of the models I had learned about in graduate school. This one didn't depend on conjecture. There were no hidden behavioral assumptions tucked inside. In fact, it wasn't really an economic model at all. It was just a simple accounting identity, true by definition. We don't need a complicated matrix to understand Godley's most simple model. It was just two moving parts, the government's financial balance and ours. Since there are only two players in this game, Uncle Sam and everyone else, it stands to reason that every payment the government makes is only one place to go. By the same logic, there's only one place any payment received by the government could have come from. It's a simple but powerful way to think about the way the government's financial balance, its surplus or deficit, impacts the rest of us. And it shows why the crowding out story gets it wrong, beginning with the first domino. The equation looks like this. Wait, there's an equation. Everybody freeze up. What? Government financial balance plus non-government financial balance equals 0? What does that mean? Stephanie goes on. Because it doesn't rest on any set of assumptions that might not hold in the real world. It's an ironclad accounting identity that will always produce an accurate statement of fact. That is, only provided that you interpret the buckets correctly. In other words, you have to give a correct interpretation. Otherwise, it's not going to produce an accurate statement of fact. If you put in something that actually belongs to the non-government and the government financial balance, things might not add up in the way you think. Anyway, you can think of it as a twist on Isaac Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. In the Godley model, we can see that for every deficit that exists in one part of the economy, there is an equal and opposite surplus in some other part. There's just no way around it. If one part of the economy is paying out more dollars than it's receiving, the other part or parts, but if there are only two parts, as in this equation, the other part must be receiving exactly that many dollars. On the other side of every minus sign lies a plus sign of equal size. Putting the same equation differently, Godley wrote, government deficit equals non-government surplus. Right? Going back to the first simple equation, government financial balance plus non-government financial balance is equal to 0. So, subtract non-government financial balance from each side of the equation, and what do you get? The non-government financial balances cancel out, and the 0 side becomes the non-government financial balance. And so we end up with government financial balance equals non-government surplus. Or in this case, government deficit equals non-government surplus. Okay. So she says it's a most powerful observation and one that deals a fatal blow to the simple crowding out story. To see why, let's translate Godley's model into even simpler language. We'll just need 2 buckets. Here come the buckets again. The goal is to look at the part of the crowding out story that claims that government deficits eat up part of our savings. First, let's look at an example of how financial payments move between the 2 parts of our economy. So suppose the government spends 100 on a fleet of new vehicles for the presidential motorcade. The vehicles will be produced by workers and businesses in the private, non-government part of the economy. Sorry. Every dollar the government spends has to go somewhere. And there is only one place those dollars can go: into the non-government bucket. Let's also assume that the rest of us collectively paid the government $90 in the form of taxes. So you see the diagram there. Taxes are going from the non-government to the government. Spending is going from the government to the non-government. That leaves the non-government with a $10 surplus and the government with a $10 deficit, a minus $10. Well, guess what? A deficit for the government is good news, money in the pocket for the non-government. How can anybody deny that? If these were the only payments made by and to Uncle Sam, the CBO would report the government had a fiscal deficit and it would record a minus in its annual budget report. But wait, Steph says, that's not all that happened. The government's fiscal deficit is mirrored by an equal and opposite financial surplus in the non-government part of our economy. Uncle Sam's red ink is our black ink. That's the title of this chapter, isn't it? His deficit is our financial surplus. Just follow the money. 100 goes into our bucket, 90 goes back out to pay taxes, $10 is left in our bucket. Every fiscal deficit makes a financial contribution to the non-government bucket. Godley was a sticker for details. His models were, as he put it, stock flow consistent. It's a fancy way of saying that all of the financial contributions that flowed into our bucket over time would exactly match the stockpile of dollar assets we must end up accumulating. In other words, every financial outflow had to become a financial inflow. And over time, these flows must accumulate into corresponding stocks of financial assets. Let's go back to the preceding page for a minute before we get to the bathtub. If we had this happening for 2 years, $10 wouldn't be left in the non-government bucket. $20 would be left in the non-government bucket. Looking at the second year alone, we'd have $10 left in the bucket. But looking at the bucket over the 2 years, we'd have a stock of $20 that had accumulated over the 10 years. If we look at the deficit over the 2 years, we would have had a deficit that accumulated over 2 years of $20. Would that deficit be a debt? Well, not so fast. We'll talk about that later, whether that has to be a debt or doesn't have to be a debt. But there is a separate concept, a separate notion of a cumulative deficit. Now notice, the national debt is not the cumulative deficit. What the national debt is it's the principal outstanding on debt instruments that haven't been redeemed yet. So it's defined in a different way from the cumulative deficit. The cumulative deficit is just the stock of deficits over more than a time period, over multiple time periods. That's all that is. So let's go back and get into the bathtub. To grasp the point, Steph says, think of your bathtub. Water flows into the tub when you turn on the faucet, and water flows out of the tub when you open the drain. If the water is draining at least as fast as it's flowing in, the tub will never accumulate any standing water, and you'll never be able to take a bath, right? Unless you do very fast. But if you add water faster than you siphon it away, the water level will rise as the tub begins to fill. That's what's happening in Exhibit 3 above. Where's Exhibit 3? There's Exhibit 3. What's happening is that in the second bucket, there is an accumulation. The government is letting $100 flow into our bucket and only siphoning $90 down the drain. The flow of red ink, lamented by Jason Furman, fills our bucket with dollars. Fiscal deficits don't eat up our savings, they enlarge them. Now, how can this argument be any better? How can it be any tighter? How can Jason Furman today not understand that the flow of red ink, which he lamented in 2007, or was it 2008 or 2009, I forget. How can he forget that the red ink that he lamented then is good news for the private sector? Because it represents financial assets being gained by the private sector. Fiscal deficits don't eat up our savings, they enlarge them. If Uncle Sam continues to deficit spend at this pace, he will drop another $10 into our bucket every year. Over time, those dollars will accumulate and build up financial wealth. At this pace, a decade from now, we'll end up with a stock of $100 in our bucket. We'll get to the borrowing in just a bit, but first let's consider what would happen if Congress had followed Furman's advice and eliminated budget deficits and ran its budget on a pay-go basis, as shown in Exhibit 4. There's Exhibit 4 right there. Spending 100, taxing 100, government balance equals 0, non-government balance equals 0. The government balancing its budgets. By holding its spending in line with taxes, the dreaded red ink is eliminated. But what's this? The non-government bucket has lost its financial surplus. Now, it's possible this is a good outcome. Remember, MMT asked us to focus on economic outcomes, not on budgetary outcomes. So if a balanced budget can deliver good overall conditions in our economy, that is full employment and price stability, then there's no reason to complain the government has balanced its books. Well, there still might be a reason, because people might want to have some savings too. But anyway, most of the time, however, our economy will need the support of fiscal deficits to keep things in balance. The trick is to prevent the deficit from getting too big or too small. As we learned in Chapter 2, spending too much or taxing too little can lead to problems. So imagine an extreme scenario where the government allowed us to keep every dollar it put into our bucket, never taxing anything away. That's like closing the drain in the bathtub and letting every drop of spending accumulate in our bucket. Before long, the tub would overfill and our economy would overheat. Inflation would quickly take hold as too much money sloshed around in our bucket. The right-sized deficit is the one that provides just enough support to keep our economy humming along without rising inflation. Deficits can be too big, but they can also be too small. We can use our two buckets to look one last time at the much celebrated Clinton surpluses from 1998-2001. Prior to 1998, the government had been running persistent deficits. So persistent, in fact, that I don't think that there was a year in which the budget had been balanced since 1968. If I recall correctly, it hadn't been balanced any year since 1968. We'd been accumulating. Since 1968, the private sector had been accumulating all those dollars each year. All those dollars each year. And then finally, Steph says, suddenly the situation reversed itself. Instead of dollars flowing from Uncle Sam's bucket into ours, they started moving in the opposite direction. As Exhibit 5 shows, Uncle Sam got the plus sign and we got the minus sign. We can illustrate this using simple numbers. Put Uncle Sam in surplus, the government had to tax away more dollars than it spent, $90 into our bucket in 1998. The only way for Uncle Sam to do that, to collect more dollars than he currently spends, is take back some of the dollars he supplied us in private years. He wanted to and did take back some of our stock of wealth that was in the non-government sector. You see, when government runs a fiscal surplus, the non-government sector loses money. The government surplus gains money, but not really, because for reasons we'll go over some other, that money just goes down the drain because the government neither has nor has any dollars. But that's another story. We'll undertake that a little later. Once again, by a little later, I mean in another program. Once again, we've eliminated the dreaded red ink on the government's balance sheet. Indeed, Uncle Sam is now in the black, but don't break out the champagne just yet. Remember, on the other side of every financial surplus is a financial deficit of equal size. That means the government black ink became our red ink. The Clinton surpluses forced us to sacrifice some of the dollars we have been saving in our budget. The crowding out story gets it completely backward. It's fiscal surpluses, not fiscal deficits, that eat up our financial saving. That is something to note and never forget. It's the fiscal surpluses at the federal level, just at the federal level, not the fiscal deficits that eat up our financial savings. Steph then asks, why do so few economists bother to point this out? When the CBO publishes its annual budget outlook, they're only telling half the story. They report the government's current and projected financial balance, but they don't bother to point out what it implies for those of us in the other bucket. They supply the data, big, scary deficit numbers that politicians and pundits use to terrorize the population. That's us. But they make no attempt to show how those deficits necessarily impact our financial balances. So the public is bombarded with one-sided coverage that only looks at fiscal deficits from one vantage point. For example, in 2009, the editorial board to New York Post ran an opinion piece under the headline, quote, locking in a future of trillion-dollar deficits. A year later, the Wall Street Journal had foreshadowed this with a similar headline. By the way, give me that future of trillion-dollar deficits. I want that. Multi-trillion-dollar deficits. A year later, the Wall Street Journal had foreshadowed this with a similar headline. Why trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal. I bet the Wall Street Journal is having private champagne parties celebrating why trillion-dollar deficits could be the normal. Because they really know which end is up there. They just don't want to tell us. The problem is that no one bothers to show readers how the pieces fit together. The government's fiscal outlook is considered the whole story. It's not. They want us to believe it's the whole story. That was Maggie Thatcher's. There's no government money. There's no public money. It's only your money, remember? The government's fiscal outlook is considered, there is no money tree, right? The government's fiscal outlook is considered the whole story. It's not. To improve the public discourse, we need to think like a deficit owl. Those hawks and doves we met in chapter 3 spend too much time squawking about red ink and not enough time helping the public to see what that red ink means for the rest of us. To see the full picture, you have to be able to look at the flow of payments from a different angle. That's what makes the deficit owl a better budget bird, a better budget bird, a better budget bird, a better budget bird. Say that 3 times fast. The owl has full range of motion. It can turn its head to see what the others are missing. A handy guy to have around if you want the entire picture. Godley was a deficit owl. That's why he was able to see what so many others were missing. As the government's budget moved into surplus beginning in 1998, while Democratic politicians and the vast majority of economists cheered the Clinton surpluses, Godley sounded the alarm because his model didn't leave anything out. He was able to see that the government surpluses were siphoning away a portion of our financial savings. As the President's Council of Economic Advisors was busy drafting the infamous Life After Debt report, that was one where they thought that they were going to retire the debt completely. Godley was publishing reports that shined a spotlight on the private sector deficits that nearly everyone else was ignoring. He was virtually alone in predicting that the Clinton surpluses would undermine the recovery and ultimately drive the federal budget back into deficit. That's because fiscal surpluses rip financial wealth away from the rest of us, leaving us with less purchasing power to support the spending that keeps our economy going. And by the way, that's even more true because our economy, as you know, has a vast vacuum cleaner at the top that sucks up net financial assets towards the top. So what happened was that while financial wealth was being ripped away from the rest of us, it was also being ripped away from the bottom sectors of the economy towards the top sectors of the economy, the people in power and the corporations in power. And what the result of that is that it left consumers, the consumer drivers of sales in the economy, with much less purchasing power to support the spending that keeps our economy going. That's what was going on distributionally. Godley's approach shows that in purely financial terms, every fiscal deficit is good for someone. That's because government deficits are always matched penny for penny by a financial surplus in the non-government bucket. At the macro, big picture level, Uncle Sam's red ink is always our blank ink. When he spends more dollars into our bucket than he taxes away, we get to accumulate those dollars as part of our financial wealth. But who exactly is we? And now Steph moves to the distributional question. From a 30,000-foot level, all we know is that those dollars flow into a giant bucket that includes everyone not named Uncle Sam. You're in a big bucket, and so am I. Companies like Boeing and Caterpillar are in there with us. Our trading partners, China, Mexico, Japan, and so forth, are in there too. President John F. Kennedy liked to say that, quote, a rising tide lifts all boats, unquote. He meant that when our economy does better, all of us do better too. Godley's model shows that fiscal deficits will always lift our collective non-government financial boat. But what about all of the individual boats that are floating around inside that big bucket? See, the bucket analogy is a good one. It allows you to visualize all the little individual boats in that very big bucket. Fiscal deficits have the potential to lift millions of small boats. But here, too, often the benefits of Uncle Sam's deficits aren't spread widely throughout the economy. Tax cuts that go disproportionately to the biggest corporations and the wealthiest people in society funnel riches into their budgets, while millions of families struggle to keep their boats afloat. If the goal is broadly shared prosperity, then we need fiscal deficits that channel resources more equitably. For example, investing in healthcare, education, and public infrastructure won't simply benefit the medical professionals, teachers, and construction workers who get paid to do those jobs. It will also benefit the patients, students, and drivers who benefit from better public services. And when fiscal deficits help low and middle income families, those dollars aren't hoarded in offshore bank accounts. They get spent back into the economy, helping to lift the boats that belong to families like theirs. The point is, not every deficit serves the broader public good. Deficits can be used for good or evil. They can enrich a small segment of the population, lifting the yachts of the rich and powerful to new heights while leaving millions behind. They can fund unjust wars that destabilize the world and cost millions of their lives, or they can be used to sustain life and build a more just economy that works for the many and not just the few. What they can't do is eat up our collective savings, where collective means the whole non-government. So the macro idea that the non-government savings can be eaten up by deficits, that is in error, a completely false idea. And now Stephanie really drives home the point, I think, in a great way, pointing out that the crowding out story is rooted in the Tabbs model, in Margaret Thatcher's Tabbs model. Stephanie introduced in chapter 1. Remember, that model treats Uncle Sam as a currency user who must finance his expenditures either by taxing or borrowing. If he wishes to spend S more than he expects to collect in taxes, T, then he must cover the shortfall, i.e. the deficit, by borrowing B. According to conventional economists, hawks and doves alike, if the government borrows to cover deficits, then it will use up some of the savings that would otherwise have been available to private companies and other borrowers. The story continues that if the supply of savings is reduced, then interest rates will rise as borrowers compete for a dwindling pool of available funding, driving borrowing costs higher. We have already shown that deficit spending increases our collective savings. But what happens if Uncle Sam borrows when he runs a deficit? Is that what eats up savings and forces interest rates higher? The answer, says Steph, is no. The financial crowding out story asks us to imagine that there's a fixed supply of savings from which anyone can attempt to borrow. Okay, just a word here. I know it's hard to believe that this relatively simple treatment of things in terms of the buckets, in terms of some very common sense examples, in terms of the the Tabbs model, okay, and the STAB model. It's hard to imagine that this is really going to get at some of the positions of supposedly really sophisticated Nobel Prize winning people who talk about our economy all the time and who are greatly respected in government circles and advise those at the highest level and give them excuses for what they do. But this very, very simple treatment is about to dynamite some of the biggest names, in the world. So let us get on with that. The financial crowding out story asks us to imagine that there's a fixed supply of savings from which anyone can attempt to borrow. Picture an enormous mountain of US dollars sitting in some corner of the world. Now imagine that those dollars were put there by savers, people who have dollars, but don't wish to spend everything they have. Savers make those funds available to borrowers, but only at a price. Savers earn interest on the money they lend, while borrowers pay servers for the use of those funds. It's a straightforward supply and demand story where the interest rate balances the demand for funding against the available supply. In the absence of government deficits, All demand comes from private borrowers. There's still competition for these loanable funds, but those companies are just competing with other private sector actors for a slice of the available supply, with no competition from Uncle Sam, otherwise known as Bigfoot. All savings are using to finance private investment. But if the government's budget moves into deficit, Uncle Sam will lay claim to some of that cash. As a consequence, the supply of funds available to fund private investment is diminished. Borrowing costs go up, and some companies are left without financing for their projects. It's not government deficits per se, but deficits financed by borrowing that supposedly leads to crowding out via higher interest rates. However, MMT rejects this loanable fund story. Who is the economist currently most associated with the loanable fund story? Who, in column after column, has talked about the loanable funds model and the loanable fund story? None other than Nobel Prize winning Paul Krugman. But we'll get to that shortly. MMT rejects the loanable fund story, which is rooted in the idea that borrowing is limited by access to scarce financial resources. As MMT economist Scott Fulwiler put it, the conventional quote, analysis is simply inconsistent with how the modern financial system actually works, unquote. To see why, let's take a closer look at what's actually happening when the federal government sells bonds in coordinated with its deficit spending. Since, I think this is what's coming up is, to me, crystal clear. Since MMT recognizes that the federal government doesn't operate its budget like a household, we reject the TABS model and use the currency issuer's STAB model, STAB model, instead. Remember, this model recognizes that the government is not revenue constrained like a household, so it can spend first and then tax or borrow. Suppose Congress authorizes $100 of new spending. As the government begins making payments, those dollars flow into the non-government bucket. Let us again assume that $90 is used to pay taxes. As Exhibit 6 shows, the government deficit deposits $10 into the non-government budget. If that's all that happened, those dollars would simply sit in the form of digital or physical currency, green dollars. Steph says, recall our use of green dollars from Chapter 1. Green dollars exist in the form of bank reserves or notes and coins. If the government simply left us holding green dollars, it could run a fiscal deficit without selling the government bonds that end up adding to the thing we unfortunately call national debt. But that's not the way things currently work. Under current arrangements, the government sells treasuries whenever it runs a fiscal deficit. This is normally referred to as borrowing, but as we learned in Chapter 3, that is very much a misnomer. That's because the government's own deficit supplies the dollars that are needed to purchase the bonds. To match its $10 deficit with bond sales, the government simply pulls 10 green dollars out of our bucket, out of our stock, and recycles them into 10 yellow dollars, U.S. Treasuries. Exhibit 7 shows the government removing green dollars from the non-government bucket and replacing them with interest-bearing government bonds, the yellow dollars, the U.S. Treasuries. What happened? I somehow missed. Oh, here it is. Bonds in, Bonds out almost sounds like bonsai, right? So from the non-government, US dollars come out and go into the government, and in return, the bonds come out of the government and the bonds go into the non-government. When the whole process is over, Uncle Sam will have spent $100 into our bucket, taxed $90 back out, and transformed the remaining $10 into yellow dollars called Treasury bonds. Those bonds are now part of the wealth that is held by savers at home and around the world. As Godley's model reveals, government deficits always lead to a dollar for dollar increase in the supply of net financial assets held in the non-government bucket. That's not a theory, says Steph. That's not an opinion, she says. It's just the cold, hard reality of stock flow consistent accounting. You just have to account for the other net financial assets that are present in this, or the other financial assets that are getting created in this situation. It's not just about the reserves that are flowing into the government from the Treasury's auction. It's also about the yellow dollars that are flowing into the private sector in the construct called the Treasury bonds. Those are net financial assets of the private sector. So the private sector loses no net financial assets in this transaction. In fact, it gains future net financial assets, which will come in the form of interest payments. So fiscal deficits, even with government borrowing, can't leave behind a smaller supply of dollar savings. And if that can't happen, then a shrinking pool of dollar savings can't be responsible for driving borrowing costs higher. Clearly, this presents a problem for the conventional crowding out theory, which claims that government spending and private investment compete for a finite pool of savings. The reason the loanable fund story is not in sync with reality is that it asks us to treat the federal government like a currency user. When we reject this naive lens, and you can see that it is a naive lens, we see that countries like the US aren't dependent on borrowing to fund themselves, nor are they at the mercy of private investors when they do sell bonds. Uncle Sam is not a beggar who must go hat in hand in search of funding to support his desired spending. He's a muscular currency issuer. He can choose to borrow or not, and Congress can always decide what rate of interest it will pay on any bonds it decides to offer. That's not true of all countries, but it's true of those with monetary sovereignty. The distinction is incredibly important, for there is an element of truth in the conventional narrative that budget deficits can force interest rates higher, but we must be careful in telling that story. By focusing on the monetary arrangements and the actual mechanics of deficit financing, MMT helps us avoid Novus' overly simplistic story about how this can happen. What matters most is the currency regime under which the country is operating. Unlike Greece, Venezuela, or Argentina, countries with monetary sovereignty are not at the mercy of financial markets. To see why, let's take a closer look at what happens when a monetary sovereign like the U.S. runs a fiscal deficit. MMT shows the U.S. government spends by crediting the reserve balances of private banks, which in turn credit the bank accounts of those receiving payments from the government. If you deposit a $1,000 check from Uncle Sam, Your bank will get a $1,000 credit to its reserve account at the Federal Reserve, and you will get a $1,000 credit to your own personal account. Payments made by you to the federal government have the opposite effect. For example, if you write a $500 check to pay your federal income taxes, your bank will subtract that much from your current balance, and the Fed will subtract $500 from your bank's reserve balance. When the government is spending more than it's taxing away, it leaves the banking system with a larger quantity of reserve balances. In other words, fiscal deficits increase the aggregate supply of reserve balances. What happens next depends entirely on the policy response. The government might borrow, as it does today, replacing the newly created reserve balances with U.S. Treasuries. Doing this allows the government to run fiscal deficits without altering the quantity of reserves in the banking system. From an MMT perspective, the purpose of selling bonds is not to finance government expenditures, which have already taken place, but to prevent a large infusion of reserves from pushing the overnight interest rate below the Fed's target level. Selling bonds is entirely voluntary in the sense that Congress could always decide to do things differently. Because it has monetary sovereignty, the U.S. has many options when it comes to borrowing and managing its interest rate. It could exert rigid control of the short-term interest rate, but allow financial markets to have some influence on longer-term borrowing costs. That's how it works in the U.S. today. Or it could take control of longer-term borrowing costs, the way it did during and immediately after World War II, or the way the Bank of Japan does it today. It could even dispense with treasuries altogether, which would make it all but impossible for anyone to tell a crowding out story based on the argument that government borrowing is what drives interest rates higher. Boy, that's a great reason for getting rid of the bonds, isn't it? The point is, deficits pose no inherent crowding out risk. The loanable funds theory is simply wrong. Fiscal deficits with or without bond sales do not mean an inevitable increase in interest rates. In other words, I'm adding this, of course. In other words, Paul Krugman, you are wrong. Not just Jason Furman, but you, Paul Krugman, illustrious Nobel Prize winner, have been wrong about this since you first started debating MMTers in 2009 and 2010. To understand why, let's take a brief look at how it all works today. Today, the U.S. Treasury issues what are known as risk-free securities whenever it runs a fiscal deficit. The securities are considered risk-free in the sense that a currency-issuing government can always make good on any promise to repay bondholders as long as the bonds are denominated in the government's own unit of account. Japan can always repay yen. The U.S. can always pay by U.S. dollars. And the British government can always meet any payment obligation that is denominated in British pounds. In each of these countries and others, the federal government has adopted its own procedures for placing government bonds in the hands of private buyers. The U.S. relies on an auction system to sell bonds into the private market. Whenever the federal government is expected to run a fiscal deficit, the Treasury Department offers a quantity of government securities that matches the anticipated deficit. Treasury officials decide how many securities to offer, and market participants, that is investors, compete for the limited supply. The initial sale takes place in what's known as the primary market, where a certain category of buyers called primary dealers bid for the securities. Primary dealers are defined as trading counterparties of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. There are currently 24 primary dealers. Now, this sounds very much like the kind of system that existed. I don't even know if it still exists, but I used to be a microcomputer vendor at one point in one of the incarnations, of my career. In that incarnation, I became very familiar with computer manufacturers and software manufacturers who would never sell directly to the public, but instead they had a distribution system and they would sell only to dealers. And the public had to buy from the dealers. And often, it wasn't even the case that they were only dealers. Often, the manufacturers would sell only to distributors who were like these primary dealers in direct contact with the manufacturers. And then the distributors would sell to primary dealers. Then the primary dealers would sell to the dealers. No, wait. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the distributors were like the primary dealers here, and they would sell to dealers. Okay, and then the dealers in turn would sell to the public, and that's the way that would work. So here, the primary dealers are like the microcomputer the microcomputer distributors are, and then the agencies or corporations, okay, or individuals that they sell bonds to, those are like the microcomputer end users. I don't know if this helps you to understand this better, but it immediately I recognized this type of distribution system. There are currently only 24 primary dealers, including familiar names like Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and Citigroup. After their initial purchase in the primary market by U.S. Treasuries can change hands in the secondary market. That's the market which Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and Citigroup sell into. That's us. Treasuries can change hands in the secondary market, but they don't change hands from the Federal Reserve Bank. They change hands from places like Wells Fargo and Morgan Stanley and Bank of America and Citigroup to us. That's where they become available to pensions, hedge funds, state and local government, insurance companies, foreign investors, and others. The interest rate on government bonds comes out of the competitive bidding process as primary dealers make the market by tendering bids for the entire supply at each auction. So the government has set up a hierarchical marketplace because the Fed doesn't want to deal with too many dealers or with too many agents that want to buy from it. It wants instead to be able to deal with a limited number of people. And for some reason, it doesn't want to make those people employees of the Fed. I mean, why they can't be employees of the Fed, I don't know. But I do know that Wells Fargo and Morgan Stanley and Bank of America and the other primary dealers are making quite a bit of money that is flowing from the government into the private sector and enriching certain groups in the private sector at public expense. Because when they turn around and sell it to the pensions and the hedge funds and the state and local government and the insurance companies, I mean, hell, if the government wants to give it to somebody, why don't they give this function to the state and local governments? I mean, they're limited in their funding. It would be much more in the public interest if they were the ones making the profits from selling government bonds. Why does it have to be these big private sector organizations? Anyway, I'm departing from Stephanie's book. I'm sorry. I apologize, but I thought that had to be. I couldn't let that go by without pointing that out, that obvious thing. If the government expects to run a fiscal deficit of $200 billion, the Treasury Department will arrange an auction for that amount. For each auction, Treasury officials decide the auction date, how big the auction will be, the face value of the securities, and which maturities to offer. As part of its $200 billion auction, officials might offer a block of 10-year treasuries with a face value of $1,000 each, when the auction opens, each primary dealer bids for its share of the total allotment. One of them might signal a willingness to buy a certain number of bonds, but only if they pay out $20 per year. Another primary dealer might ask for $18, and still another might submit a bid seeking $22. Each bid carries an implied rate of return. Stephanie goes through this, in some detail, so you can see the kinds of business considerations that come about here. I'm going to skip here, a little bit. Primary dealers are required to bid at reasonable rates, but they don't have to submit identical bids. If they think 2% is too low, they can try to get a high yield by submitting, a weaker bid, like, for example, 1.5% or something like that. However, weaker bids reduce the likelihood of winning the auction. There's an old trick that will help you understand the relationship between the bond yields and bond prices. Using your thumbs, give a thumbs up for strong demand from investors. Strong bids mean bond prices go thumbs up. There's an inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. So a thumbs up for higher bond prices implies a thumbs down for interest rates. It's cheaper to borrow when primary dealers indicate a willingness to buy at low interest rates. When dealers submit weaker bids, it means they're asking for higher returns. If the weakness is widespread, the Treasury Department may end up paying somewhat more than it anticipated when the auction was announced. In practice, however, Treasury auctions are always oversubscribed, meaning that there are always more bids than there are securities to go around. And then Stephanie goes in what was told to her by Deputy Secretary Frank Newman, former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. She quotes him and points out, there's always more demand. The winners in the auctions get to place their funds in the safest, most liquid form of instrument there is for U.S. dollars. And the losers are stuck keeping some of their funds in banks and having bank risks. Since demand always exceeds supply, submitting a relatively weak bid means you're likely to walk away empty-handed. So the most enthusiastic bidders are the ones who get to swap some of their reserve balances for U.S. Treasuries. And she says, this might sound like the loanable funds market. Imagine the crowding out story. It's not. The primary dealer market is a real-world market established by the federal government for the purpose of dealing exclusively in newly issued government securities. In other words, the government created the primary dealer market for the sole purpose of placing U.S. Treasuries in private hands as part of its fiscal operations. Uncle Sam doesn't enter the market in competition with other borrowers. On the other hand, on the contrary, it's the 24 primary dealers who compete with one another to win a piece of the auction. This means that even large unanticipated fiscal deficits never pose any kind of financing problem. That's because the Fed backstops the primary dealers. That's the final killer. If the primary dealers happen to be short of money, the Fed makes sure they have all the funding they require to make it profitable for them to place reasonable bids for the entire allotment. They get the money to make the reasonable bids. What a racket this is. So what is the relation between deficits and interest rates? In one respect, there's an indisputable answer. Deficits push the overnight interest rate down. In a world without bond sales or some other defensive action by the central bank, deficits will drop the short-term interest rate to zero. This was made apparent in a paper that was written by Warren Muscular and Matthew Forstater some years ago. The logic of this drive down to zero. It's a very short paper, very easy to read. That's because deficit spending fills the banking system with excess reserves, and a huge increase in the supply of reserves will push the federal funds rate to zero. The central bank doesn't want to accept the zero rate, then it must do something to move the rate into positive territory. Historically, pre-2008, it did this by performing open market operations, selling U.S. Treasuries, and draining reserve balances until the interest rate rose to the Fed target. Today, the Fed hits its interest rate target by proclamation. If it wants to adjust rates, it simply announces a new target. And voila, the interest rate is now set at the new higher or lower level. The point is that without some explicit form of intervention, fiscal deficits would naturally drive the short-term interest rate to zero. Yes, that is the point. The natural rate of interest when fiscal deficits are run is zero. That's the natural rate, okay, of interest. It's the Fed's job. It's the Fed's job to drive the interest rate above that if it has some policy objective that can be achieved by driving the interest rate higher than zero. What about other interest rates? Being a primary dealer is sort of like owning the goose that laid the golden egg. You're guaranteed a profit simply for occupying a special place in the monetary apparatus that facilitates the Treasury's fiscal option. It's a privileged position that no primary dealer wants to jeopardize. So here's the question that I ask. This is not something that Stephanie asks here and would not ask here because it wouldn't serve a useful political purpose in this context. But for us, from where we sit, it may be a useful political purpose. And that is, if these dealers are guaranteed a profit simply by occupying a special place in the monetary apparatus that actually facilitates the Treasury's fiscal operations, why shouldn't they just work for the government? Why shouldn't government employees be the distribution apparatus to the pension funds and to all of the private sector actors who want to buy the securities? Why should private sector people be making a profit from this? What does it do for the distribution of wealth? How does that help the distribution of wealth? How does that help inequality in our society? That's what I want to know. Why don't we just socialize that? To remain in good standing, all they have to do is present reasonable bids that would win them their share of treasuries at each auction. It doesn't even have to be these auctions. I mean, these auctions are a waste of time, and money. I mean, Stephanie goes on covering this, explaining it, in a very, very nice way. She makes the very important point that primary dealers, while submitting bids that express what they want to make, the interest rate they must ultimately accept is largely beyond their control. And this becomes even more obvious when you look around the world and realize roughly 1/3 of the global government bond market trades at negative nominal rates of interest. That's because the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, Sweden's Riksbank, the National Bank of Denmark, and the Swiss National Bank have all set the short-term interest rate below zero, negative. Selling bonds to private investors gives the illusion that the government is dependent on savers for financing, that financial markets can force the government to borrow on terms set by private lenders. But that's not how it works in practice. The currency issuing government doesn't need to borrow its own currency from anyone in order to spend. And even if it does borrow, it can exert substantial influence over the interest it pays on those securities. Primary dealers can signal a desire for higher rates. Oh, please, federal government, let me make a little bit more. But the Fed can always manage rates lower if it chooses to do so. There's a popular saying among savvy investors, quote, "Don't fight the Fed," unquote. If the Fed is determined to bring rates down, then there's the story of this investor named Kyle Bass. He felt certain Japanese government debt had become unsustainable, so he bet against it by shorting Japanese government bonds. When an investor shorts government bonds, they're betting the price of the bonds is going to go down price, thumbs down, and the yield, interest rate, thumbs up, is going to go up. Bass and others like him lost huge sums of money with this trading strategy. Shorting JGBs became known as the widowmaker's trade because few investors survived the resulting losses. Well, I hope that it didn't actually make any widows, even if it did make a few bankruptcies. In spite of what most economists say, there's simply no preordained relationship between fiscal deficits and interest rates. If the central bank is committed to holding rates in places or managing them lower, then fiscal deficits can't force them to rise, as the conventional crowding out story imagines. A little history will prove the point. By now, does anybody still believe in the crowding out? Well, if you do, here's another story. From 1942 until 1947, the Federal Reserve, at the behest of the Treasury Department, actively managed the government's borrowing costs. Even as spending to fight World War II drove the federal deficit to more than 25% of GDP in 1943, interest rates trended lower. That's because the Fed pegged the T-bill rate at 0.35% and held the rate on 25-year bonds at 2.5%. As MMT economist L. Randall Wray put it, quote, the government can borrow, issue bonds to the public, the borrow is in single quotes, by the way, at any interest rate the central bank chooses to enforce. It is relatively easy for the central bank to peg the interest rate on short-term government debt instruments by standing ready to purchase it at a fixed price in unlimited quantities. This is precisely what the Fed did in the United States until 1951, providing banks with an interest-earning alternative to excess reserves, but at a very low rate of interest. The Treasury Fed Accord of 1951 ended the Fed's official commitment to managing rates on behalf of the Treasury, but it did not usurp its power to do so. Indeed, the Federal Reserve retains the ability to move rates lower even if deficits soar. It's a reality that should be obvious to any casual observer of Fed policy over the last decade. When the bottom fell out of the U.S. economy in 2008, the budget deficit skyrocketed to more than 10% of GDP. As deficits climbed, the Federal Reserve cut the overnight rate to zero and held it there for 7 straight years. In addition, the Fed conducted 3 rounds of quantitative easing, buying U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which allowed the Fed to push long-term interest rates down as well. Anyone who tells you that fiscal deficits must force interest rates higher has forgotten their World War II history and ignored recent experience, and not just in the United States. And then Steph moves to the Bank of Japan and all of the things the Bank of Japan was able to do, holding its 10-year rate at around 0%. They've been explicitly targeting their yield curve. That means the Bank of Japan isn't just controlling the overnight interest rate as the Fed does, but it's effectively setting long-term interest rates as well. The Bank of Japan is committed to hold a 10-year rate at around 0%. And to do that, the central bank simply buys bonds in whatever quantity is necessary to prevent yields from rising above zero. So, I mean, the power of these central banks is immense to control rates. Not every country has these powers, as Fuller-Wilder explains, quote, the implications for economic policy are paradigm shifting for monetary sovereigns. To put it simply, the crowding out story doesn't work in countries that borrow in their own sovereign currencies. For the United States, Japan, UK, and other monetary sovereigns, the interest rate on the national debt is a policy variable. And that is one of the main points here. The national debt is a policy variable. The interest rate is a policy variable. As currency issuers, they don't need to borrow their own currency in order to spend. Bond sales are entirely voluntary. The interest rate the government chooses to pay chooses to offer is always a policy choice. That's not true of countries that lack their sovereignty when it comes to money, their monetary sovereignty. Countries like Greece, and Italy, and the other members of the Eurozone have given up, their monetary sovereignty. Then Stephanie goes into she starts talking about the difficulties Greece has had and how its interest rates rose from 4.5% to nearly 30% by February of 2012, and that they were rescued by the European Central Bank. It wasn't much of a rescue, however. Turned out what the European Central Bank was rescuing was not so much the Greek economy. What they were really actually rescuing were the debts of the Greek government to Deutsche Bank. They wanted to safeguard the capability of Greece but to repay its debts to Germany so that the fiscal crisis would not spread to Germany. That's exactly what the ECB was doing. And they were completely undermining democracy in Greece in order to do that. To learn about that in detail, you have to read my book on Greece, which is also at my website. It's about how democracy was undermined, in Greece through the European Central Bank, essentially making the banking system of Greece, it's captive as a result of Greece making the mistake of joining the Eurozone. Stephanie then moves to the examples of Russia, and Argentina, and the difficulties one can get into when one borrows in a currency that one doesn't issue. And she says the problem there is that in order to defend the exchange rate peg, the government has to give up control of the interest rate. She says, here's what happened in Russia. You could hold, the domestic currency, the ruble, or you could ask the central bank to convert your rubles into something else. You could swap your rubles for dollars at the fixed exchange rate, or you could use your rubles to buy the government bonds, Russian government bonds. As Forstater and Muscular have observed, government securities can be thought of as competing with the conversion to dollar options. As long as most people were willing to hold either rubles, or GKOs, things worked fairly well. The Russian government could issue both, but all hell broke loose in 1998 when suddenly everyone wanted US dollars from Russia. As demand for the GKOs collapsed, the price of Russian bonds collapsed, and yields rose sharply, just as the Greek government was incapable of preventing a spike in borrowing costs. Countries that fixed their exchange rates sacrificed control of their interest rates. From an MMT perspective, this explains the very high interest rates paid by governments with perceived default risk in fixed exchange rate regimes, in contrast to the ease a nation such as Japan has in keeping rates at zero in a floating exchange rate system, despite deficits that would undermine a fixed exchange rate regime. The lesson is simple. Currency regimes matter. The simple crowding out story was built for a world that no longer exists, yet conventional economic theory treats the sequence of falling dominoes as an inevitable consequence of deficit spending. The truth is the story has limited applicability. As Timothy Sharp put it, financial crowding out theory was initially proposed and analyzed in the context of a convertible currency system That is the gold standard and Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate agreement 1946-1971. Taking into account different currency regimes changes everything. That's what Sharpe discovered in a sweeping empirical investigation, where he separated countries that fixed the MMT model, that is, those came with monetary sovereignty, from those that fix their exchange rate or borrow in a foreign currency. Consistent with MMT, he concluded empirical evidence reveals crowding out effects in non-sovereign economies, but not within sovereign economies. In other words, it's a mistake to apply the crowding out story to monetary sovereigns like the US, Japan, the UK, or Australia, or New Zealand, by the way. Truth is, government deficits aren't the villains of progress. They don't make it harder for the private sector to borrow and invest. In almost all cases, they make it easier. That's because Uncle Sam's deficits feed dollars into our bucket. Whether those dollars arrive in the form of tax cuts or increased spending, they leave some of us with greater spending power. And spending is the lifeblood of capitalism. Without it, businesses would have no customers, no sales revenue, and no profits to keep them afloat. As Nobel Prize-winning economist William Vickery put it, well-targeted deficits will generate added disposable income, enhance the demand for the products of industry, and make private investment more profitable. In other words, well-designed fiscal policies, including those that increase fiscal deficits, can catalyze private investment, sparking a virtuous cycle that leads to the crowding in of private investment rather than crowding it out. And that is Stephanie's parting shot. Now, if that chapter 4, does not suffice to utterly take down the whole crowding out myth and the austerity narrative that follows from it, I don't know what will. I don't know how anybody can read that masterful chapter, moving from very simple concepts to extremely sophisticated lines of reasoning and real world analysis. I don't see how anybody could read that argument from start to finish and still give any credence at all to crowding out, to the Tabbs model, to Margaret Thatcher's form of economics, to the Pete Peterson Foundation and their brand, of guff, to the stuff you hear continuously from CBO, and from conventional Washington. It's all total nonsense. And this wonderful, masterful chapter, these first 4 chapters together, taken together, I mean, all of it is just not only positive in itself for MMT, but a great destruction of the current alternative model that dominates Washington politics right now and the way people do their legislation. In the next few weeks, we're going to see people come forward with all kinds of silly reasons why they don't want to do what needs to be done for people right now in the middle of this suffering that everybody's experiencing. The end of July will be fast approaching soon. And these people in Congress are going to sit on their hands, moaning and groaning about how they have no money after they've bailed out to a huge extent all the rich corporations, and they're going to pour mouth it, talking about fiscal responsibility and deficits that are just too large and having no money and crowding out and all the other austerity crap that we've been used to for so long that has no validity at all in the face of what we've seen so far from Stephanie Kelton in this particular book. It seems like with every chapter that we go through, this book gets better and better. I apologize tonight for not having had the time to go on to the trade chapter, which is also very, very good. I'm going to have to do that, okay, on Monday, and hope to get through a few chapters on Monday. But this chapter was just so good in all its details that I had to go through the whole thing and comment on the whole thing for you, because the more I got into it, the more I just realized. I mean, I've read it 2 or 3 times already, but until you read the thing out loud and you comment on it, you just don't get the full impact. It just doesn't really hit you. So, color me hit. I'm hit right now. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for tonight about that. I'm now going to move to your comments, as I usually do. Thanks for being so patient with me. Okay, I'll go to your comments right now. Boy, there haven't been too many. I must have been competing with a lot of good stuff tonight. Stephanie said, hey, love's about to share the groups. PM some folks. Thanks, Steph. Dale said, good evening, friends. Sorry I'm late to the party. Kay says, hope she makes an inroad to the Biden idiots. Well, maybe this book is out in time to make some inroads. I understand it's climbing in the charts quite fast. I hope it is. It really should. Kay says, another almost a 90-degree day here in Northeast Ohio. I'm roasting. I'm sorry to hear it, Kay. I'm sure it's really bad. Stephanie says, okay, so guys, most groups have gone private. I literally made a statement and then had to copy and paste the link. And the majority of them, oh, wow, have gone private, which means we're going to need admin moderator approval. I posted a statement and then pasted the link for Dr. Joe's show. So it may take a minute for people to actually see it and for the numbers to come in. Just a heads up. Well, thanks, Steph. Finally shared and put all my groups, especially the largest ones. That's terrific. Terrific, Stephanie. Rob says, hey, Yoda. Hello, everyone. Hello, Rob. Hey, Rob. More Stephanie Kelton. The book is great. Hi, Rob. Hi, Dolores. How do you explain the stagflation of the 70s? Oh, the stagflation of the 70s, Kay, is easy but to explain. I've explained it a dozen times here before. What the stagflation of the 70s had to do with was cost push inflation. There is, Thomas, okay, there's an earlier video that I just did last week sometime. Okay, I guess it was. It's on chapter 2, part 2. Okay, that gets into the causes of inflation. Okay, and in that video, I treat the stagflation of the 1970s somewhat, but I also have a more detailed treatment and write-up of the stagflation of the 1970s in my book, Real Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 1. I will leave the link to that for you, but that covers fiscal responsibility in the Carter administration, complete with the stagflation story and what the causes of stagflation actually were and what the remedies for stagflation should have been. And it also explains how one of the remedies for stagflation kicked in and did a lot of good for Ronald Reagan, even though the remedy was implemented originally by Jimmy Carter. So you might be interested, okay, in reading that. And I'll leave you a link for it. And Rick Wolf says, the Fed is now buying up high-risk bonds again. Yes, otherwise known as junk bonds. Right. They're buying junk bonds. And Jerome Powell has announced that he was going to do that because he wanted to stabilize that whole market. So he's basically deciding to give free money to the junk bonds people. Great, right? Great, wonderful. Steph says, good night, guys. I simply got to go to sleep. I'm just hurting way too bad. Thanks very much for coming, Steph. But like I said, I share to all the largest groups I'm in and all the other groups I'm in. Like I said, most groups are private now. So it took a while to share and get it posted into all my groups. I made the comment, something progressive that hasn't been discussed in many progressive circles, and then copied and pasted Dr. Joe's live stream. Hopefully a lot of people will see everybody's shares tomorrow, and that would be great. Kay says, love you back, Stephanie Smith Udy. Steve Dundas says, Coachella 2020 was a bust. And Laura says, love you too, rest up. Yeah, I'm sorry, I was coughing a lot tonight. I'll tell you what that's from, too. Okay, that's from the air conditioning. It's very hot, so of course, for a while at the beginning of the stream, we had our air conditioning on. And we had to have it on for 15 or 20 minutes or something like that. And during that time, my cough sort of came up. But the air conditioning always causes the cough, and then it goes away again. I'm probably going to have to cough my throat before I start one of these things. Probably should get into that habit. I've got some throat coughing stuff. Any other comments or questions? If there are no comments or questions, then I'm going to answer one of the questions I was just asked in a I'm going to supply the link that has the answer to the question that I was asked. Let me see. There we go. Okay, so I've asked a question by Thomas Sermon. Tom Serman. So, Tom, I'm going to put this link in the comments for you. It's a link to my book, Real Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 1. The Progressive Give Up Formula. That's the subtitle of it. It's a Kindle book. It goes for $9.99. And it has the answer to your question. Or at least it has my answer to your question. Any other comments or questions? If not, I'm going to say good night. Everybody have a wonderful Father's Day tomorrow, whether you're a father or not. And I will try to have a wonderful Father's Day tomorrow, though it's slightly dampened, though, this year because of for part of the week, okay, I had some stomach problems, as I think you know, okay, or digestive problems, and I'm beginning to get over them, but I still don't think that it would be a good idea to take in any food from outside of the house tomorrow. I probably have to rely on my own cooking. Which, even though I like a lot, I still occasionally like to have certain dishes from outside. Well, right now, my Father's Day plans are severely constrained because my son, okay, and my granddaughters are coping with a family crisis on the other side of the family. Okay, and while Bonnie and I are perfectly well able to yuck it up ourselves, we are a little constrained by the dietary problems I had this week. Thank you, Sandy. How are you? So that's what's cracking with Father's Day. Okay, says my old daddy has been gone since 1986. Still miss him every day. Yeah, I guess we all miss our fathers, okay, and our mothers. It's one of those things. Okay, Bonnie and I hope we'll be around for some time to come, so people won't have to be missing us for quite a while. But of course, everybody hopes that, one never knows about things like that. Anyway, everybody have a great day tomorrow. And we'll find a way to have a great day too. And I'll see you on Monday with more of Stephanie's book. I'm just getting more and more enthusiastic and impressed with it. The more I go through it, I know you're hearing this and everything I'm saying. I'm just so that's the way it is. Anyway, take care.